Hey everyone, welcome back to Tales and Talks, Climbing the Language Ladder. I'm Sophia, and with me, as always, is the amazing Adrian.
Hello, hello. Great to be back with all our wonderful listeners. Last week, we tackled the art of mastering small talk, and wow, the feedback was incredible.
It really was. And you know what's funny, Adrian? After talking about small talk, we got so many messages asking about what comes next. You know, when conversations get a bit deeper and opinions start flying.
Perfect timing. Because today we're diving into something we all need help with sometimes. How to share our opinions and disagree with others without turning the conversation into a battle zone.
Oh my goodness, yes. Whether it's discussing movies with friends, sharing ideas at work, or debating current events with family, we've all been in situations where we wished we had better tools for expressing our views.
And let's be honest. In today's world, where everyone has a platform to share their thoughts, knowing how to disagree politely is becoming more important than ever.
Absolutely. So get ready, everyone. We're about to explore some fantastic phrases and strategies that'll help you navigate those tricky conversations with confidence and grace.
You know, Sophia, I've been thinking about why this topic is so crucial in today's world. We're all constantly sharing our thoughts on social media, in meetings, even in our family WhatsApp groups.
Oh, those family WhatsApp groups. Don't even get me started, Adrian. But you're absolutely right. And what I've noticed is that when people express their opinions respectfully, it completely changes the dynamic of the conversation.
It really does. Think about it. When someone starts a sentence with, "You're wrong," or "That's stupid," what's your immediate reaction?
I definitely feel my defenses going up. It's like putting up a wall before the conversation even has a chance to develop.
Exactly. But when someone takes the time to express their opinion respectfully, it creates this safe space where real dialogue can happen. It's like opening a door instead of building a wall.
And you know what's fascinating? Research shows that respectful communication actually helps people retain information better and be more open to different perspectives.
That's so interesting. I've also noticed that when we express our opinions respectfully, it often leads to these incredibly rich conversations where everyone learns something new.
Yes, and it's not just about being nice. It's about being effective. When we share our views respectfully, people are more likely to actually hear what we're saying rather than just preparing their counterargument.
And let's not forget about the workplace. I've seen so many great ideas get lost simply because they weren't presented in a way that made others feel comfortable engaging with them.
Absolutely. It's like building a bridge instead of a barrier. When we express ourselves respectfully, we're essentially saying, "I value this relationship more than winning an argument." Now that we understand why respectful communication matters, let's dive into some practical techniques for expressing our opinions effectively.
Yes, and I think the best way to do this is through some examples. Shall we do a little role play to show our listeners how this works?
Perfect idea. Let's start with some of those really helpful phrases that can make a big difference. Instead of saying, "This is the way it should be done," we can say,
In my experience, I found that, or from my perspective. These phrases immediately show that we're sharing a personal view rather than stating an absolute truth.
Exactly. Let me give it a try. Adrian, what do you think about working from home versus working in the office?
I believe working from the office creates better team dynamics and creativity.
Now, that was direct, wasn't it? Let's try that again, but this time with some of our techniques.
Ah, yes. How about this? From my experience, I've found that working in the office tends to foster more spontaneous collaboration and creative discussions. What has been your experience with it?
Much better. Notice how adding phrases like "I've found that" and asking about the other person's experience makes it more inviting to engage in discussion.
And here's another important tip. Backing up our opinions with specific examples or reasons. It's not just about using softer language. It's about explaining our thinking.
Let's demonstrate that. I think remote work can be just as effective as office work. Wait, let me rephrase that with an example.
Go for it.
In my experience, I've noticed that remote work can be highly effective. For instance, during my last project, our team actually increased productivity by 20% when working remotely because we had fewer interruptions and more focused time.
That's excellent. You supported your opinion with concrete evidence while keeping the door open for discussion. Another helpful phrase is, "I've noticed that," which sounds more observational than judgmental.
And don't forget about tone. Even with all the right phrases, if our tone sounds condescending or aggressive, it can still put people off.
Such a good point. Let's show them the difference. First, I'll say something with a confrontational tone. Well, obviously, remote work has its problems.
Now try it with a more thoughtful, open tone.
I've been thinking about remote work, and while it has many benefits, I've observed some challenges that might be worth discussing. What are your thoughts on this?
Now, let's talk about something that can be really tricky. How to disagree with someone politely and constructively.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most valuable skills we can develop in our communication toolkit.
Let's share some really effective phrases that our listeners can use when they need to express disagreement. One of my favorites is, "I see your point, but I've had a different experience."
That's a great one. Another helpful phrase is, "I understand where you're coming from," and at the same time, it acknowledges the other person's perspective before introducing a different view.
Should we demonstrate these in action, Adrian?
Perfect idea. Let's say we're discussing the best way to learn a new language. I'll start. I think the most effective way is to take intensive classroom courses.
I see your point about classroom learning, and I understand the benefits of structured education. However, in my experience, immersion through living in a country where the language is spoken tends to be more effective.
Notice how Sophia didn't just shut down my idea? She acknowledged it first, then offered her alternative view. Let's try another example.
Okay, here's one. I believe social media is mostly harmful to society.
That's an interesting perspective. While I agree that social media has its challenges, I've observed how it can also connect people in meaningful ways, especially during difficult times like the pandemic.
Excellent example. You started with, "That's an interesting perspective," which shows respect for my opinion, even though you disagree.
Another powerful phrase is, "Help me understand." For example, "Help me understand what experiences have led you to that conclusion."
And don't forget about body language and tone of voice. Even the most polite phrases can sound sarcastic if we're not careful with our delivery.
Absolutely right. Let's demonstrate. First, I'll say something with poor tone. Well, I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
Now try it with sincere interest.
That's a perspective I hadn't considered before. Could you tell me more about how you came to that conclusion?
The difference is striking, isn't it? It's not just what we say, but how we say it that matters.
We've talked about phrases and tone, but there's another crucial element we need to discuss: active listening.
Oh yes, active listening is absolutely essential when we're having discussions, especially when there are differing opinions involved.
Exactly. It's not just about waiting for your turn to speak. It's about truly understanding what the other person is saying.
One really effective technique is to paraphrase what you've heard. It shows you're paying attention and helps ensure you've understood correctly.
Let me demonstrate. Sophia, tell me about your weekend plans.
Well, I'm thinking of going hiking on Saturday morning, then meeting some friends for lunch, and maybe catching up on some reading in the afternoon.
So if I understand correctly, you're planning an active morning with a hike, followed by social time with friends, and then some quiet time with your books. Did I get that right?
Perfect. See how Adrian repeated back what I said, but in his own words? That's paraphrasing, and it's super helpful in conversations.
Another important aspect of active listening is paying attention to nonverbal cues. Nodding occasionally, maintaining appropriate eye contact, and having an open posture all show that you're engaged.
Don't forget about those little verbal acknowledgments too. Things like, I see, or go on, can encourage the speaker to continue and show you're following along.
And one of my favorite techniques is asking clarifying questions. Instead of assuming we know what someone means, we can ask things like, "Could you elaborate on that?" Or, "What do you mean when you say?"
These skills are especially valuable when opinions differ because they help prevent misunderstandings and show respect for the other person's viewpoint.
And when someone feels heard and understood, they're much more likely to listen to your perspective in return.
Now that we understand the importance of active listening, let's talk about something that can really transform a disagreement: finding common ground.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how often people who seem to completely disagree actually share some basic values or goals.
Right. Instead of focusing on what divides us, we can start by identifying what we both agree on. It's like building a bridge from both sides.
I love that analogy. Let me give our listeners a practical example. Say you're discussing whether remote work or office work is better.
Oh, that's a hot topic these days.
Instead of immediately defending your position, you might start with something like, "We both want what's best for team productivity and work-life balance, right?"
Yes. And here's a really useful phrase I like to use. Yes, and instead of no, but.
That's brilliant. Can you demonstrate the difference?
Sure. Instead of saying no, but office work reduces productivity because of commute time, you might say, yes, face-to-face interaction is valuable. And we could also consider how flexible hours might help people work when they're most productive.
I notice how that approach keeps the conversation flowing rather than shutting it down. It's like adding to the discussion rather than contradicting it.
Exactly. Another strategy is to explicitly acknowledge valid points in the other person's argument. Something like, you make an excellent point about team building in the office.
And remember, finding common ground doesn't mean you have to abandon your position. It's about creating a foundation for mutual understanding.
Sometimes it helps to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Often we're actually working toward the same goals, just with different approaches.
That's such a valuable perspective. It turns what could be an adversarial conversation into a collaborative, problem-solving session.
Now, let's tackle something that can be really challenging, keeping our cool when discussions get heated.
Oh yes, we've all been there. Those moments when you can feel your heart racing and your temperature rising.
The key is to remember that staying calm isn't just about looking professional. It actually helps you think more clearly and communicate better.
I find taking a deep breath really helps. Sometimes I even count to 3 in my head before responding.
That's a great tip. And you know what I've learned? It's perfectly okay to say something like, I notice this topic is getting quite emotional. Should we take a short break?
Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with pressing pause. In fact, it often leads to more productive conversations when you return to the topic later.
Another strategy I use is to focus on the issue, not the person. Instead of saying you always exaggerate things, try, let's look at the specific facts we're discussing.
And sometimes, when emotions are running high, it helps to acknowledge the other person's feelings. Something like, I can see this really matters to you.
Yes, and remember to watch your body language and tone of voice. Even if you're saying all the right words, crossed arms and an aggressive tone can send the wrong message.
Here's a practical phrase I love using when things get tense. I want to understand your perspective better. Could you help me see what I might be missing?
That's brilliant. It shows you're still engaged in the conversation while also diffusing tension.
And if someone does become confrontational, remember you can always say, I'd like to continue this conversation when we're both feeling less emotional about it.
These conversations are like a dance. Sometimes you need to take a step back to move forward more effectively.
And remember, listeners, it's okay to end a heated discussion if you feel it's no longer productive. You can always revisit it when everyone's had time to cool down and reflect.
Let's look at some real-world examples where people managed to disagree respectfully and actually achieved amazing results.
Oh, I love this part. You know, one of my favorite examples is from the business world. There were these 2 co-founders of a tech startup who had completely different visions for their company.
Instead of letting it tear them apart, they used the techniques we've been discussing today, right?
Exactly. Instead of saying, you're wrong, they each took turns presenting their ideas and actively listening to each other. They ended up combining both their visions and created something even better than either had imagined alone.
That's fantastic. I've got another great example from my experience as a teacher. 2 students had totally opposite views on a class project theme.
Oh, tell us more about that one.
Well, instead of arguing, they used the I see your point and approach we discussed earlier. They ended up creating a project that incorporated both their ideas, and it won first place in the school competition.
That's so inspiring. You know what these examples show? That disagreements, when handled well, can actually lead to innovation and better solutions.
There's also this fascinating example from a community project where neighbors disagreed about how to use a vacant lot.
Let me guess. Instead of getting into heated arguments, they found common ground?
Exactly! They used active listening and respectful dialogue. Instead of making it a park or a community garden, they created a mixed-use space that satisfied everyone's needs.
These stories really show that it's not about winning an argument, but finding solutions that work for everyone.
And in each case, the key was using those respectful phrases and techniques we've been talking about today.
Plus, staying calm and really listening to understand the other person's perspective, not just waiting for your turn to speak.
Well, Adrian, we've covered quite a journey today in learning how to share opinions and disagree politely.
We sure have. And remember, everyone, these skills aren't just nice to have. They're essential for building better relationships and having more productive conversations.
Exactly. Whether you're at work, with family, or just chatting with friends, using phrases like, I see your point and I understand where you're coming from can make such a difference.
And don't forget to actually listen. It's not just about waiting for your turn to speak.
We'd love to hear how these techniques work for you. Try them out this week and let us know your experiences.
Yes, share your stories with us on our social media channels, or leave a comment on our website. Maybe you've got some interesting disagreement situations where you can apply these methods.
And remember, it takes practice. Don't get discouraged if it feels a bit awkward at first.
That's right. Start small, maybe with low-stakes conversations, and build your way up to the tougher discussions.
Thank you all for joining us today on Tales and Talks. Keep climbing that language ladder, and we'll see you next week.
And don't forget to subscribe to catch our next episode, where we'll be discussing how to give and receive compliments naturally in English. Until then, keep practicing and stay positive.